Some children are born into love, some into chaos, and then there are those who are never born at all, not on paper, not in memory, not in the eyes of the world, just shadows, hidden, owned, erased. Cinematic whisper under eerie ambient music. You were never meant to know about this. For 17 years, a Victorian house on a quiet Pennsylvania hill held a secret darker than any asylum. Behind its manicured hedges and antique curtains lived 12 children, with no birth certificates, no school records, and no existence outside the property line. They had no birthdays, no medical histories, no last names of their own. Legally, they didn't exist. And that wasn't an accident. It was the plan. The Falling family, Howard and Margaret, were seen as saviors in their quaint town of Millbrook, wealthy, charming, generous donors to the church. They restored the haunted house on Elm Street into a dream estate and filled it with laughter, or so everyone believed. But what really happened inside those walls wasn't family. It was a system, a controlled environment, a laboratory for psychological obedience, learned helplessness, and silence. The children were homeschooled, isolated, forbidden to speak without permission. No photos, no friends, no history. And whenever one child disappeared, another was quietly adopted. It was always explained away. They moved. They had special needs. It's not your business. And in Millbrook, appearances were everything. By the time a child named Thomas fell out of a tree and landed in the hospital with a shattered arm, the town had no more excuses. His bones were broken, his voice too. He didn't even know his own birthday, and when the doctor asked for records, there were none. The files had burned, said Howard. The agency was closed. The trail ended. But whispers were growing louder. Why did all 12 children look hollow-eyed and dead silent in church? Why was the third floor always locked? Why did one nurse hear a child sobbing behind a sealed door? The deeper you look into this story, the more your sense of reality will crack. Because the Follings weren't just hiding kids. They were hiding a model, one built not on nurturing, but on control. This isn't a family horror story. It's a lesson, and it's only just begun. The Follings weren't collecting children. They were curating obedience. Each adoption was more like an acquisition, timed precisely and chosen carefully. Margaret, once a pediatric nurse, knew exactly what to look for. Quiet kids, traumatized kids, children from broken homes or failed systems. They weren't adopting to nurture. They were adopting to erase. Every new child arrived with less paperwork than the one before. Some came across state lines, some from shuttered agencies, and always the same story. No photos, no medical files, no questions. The house on Elm Street became its own country, its own sealed world. A place where language meant compliance and eye contact was a punishable offense. One boy, aged 7, was reportedly locked in a windowless room for 3 days because he laughed without permission. Another, a girl named Elizabeth, was forced to recite obedience pledges before every meal, standing barefoot on cold tile until she got every word perfect. These weren't parents. These were keepers, curators of silence, builders of a human archive never meant to be seen. And still, no one dared interfere. The neighbors saw the children only in glimpses, lined up like chess pieces at church, silent, unmoving, never blinking too long. The few staff members hired to clean or cook never stayed long. One housekeeper recalled being instructed never to enter the 3rd floor. Food goes on the tray. Knock 3 times. Don't wait for a thank you. When asked who lived up there, Margaret would smile and say, "Our delicate ones." But when one staffer heard singing, Off-key, low, almost like a lullaby in reverse. She quit that night and never came back. What kind of song sounds like a warning? What kind of family teaches children to fear birthdays? Over time, even the local church began to sense something was wrong. A deacon once visited unannounced and found Margaret standing behind James, the eldest boy, her hands on his shoulders like reins. When the boy was asked a question, he looked to her, then to the floor. He never spoke, not even his name. It was as if he needed permission to exist. The Falling family built a fortress around obedience and called it home. But every fortress has a crack, and it started with a window, a locked third-floor window, where someone saw a face that didn't belong to any of the 12. That third-floor window became an obsession for Susan Fletcher. She was a seasoned social worker, newly arrived in Millbrook, and she'd seen trauma before, but never wrapped in lace curtains and Victorian charm. It started with a glimpse, a pale face behind glass, watching, waiting, vanishing the moment their eyes met. The child wasn't one of the 12. Susan had memorized their names, their faces, their vacant stares. This one was different, alert, wide-eyed, as if silently screaming from the inside. From that moment, Susan began documenting everything. Every strange sound, every unusual pattern, every time a child flinched when spoken to. She had coffee with Margaret, earning trust, pretending curiosity. But behind her calm smile, she was taking notes. Handwritten pages she kept locked in a metal box under her bed. She noticed the same dress worn by 2 different girls. The odd way children changed rooms every few months. And always, always, the rule: no birthdays. "We celebrate adoption days instead," Margaret explained, her voice syrupy and flat. "Birthdays can be emotionally confusing for them." But confusion wasn't the problem. Control was. These children weren't allowed to remember where they came from. Their pasts were sanded down, their names reshaped, their timelines rewritten. And Susan could feel it. This wasn't just parenting, it was behavioral engineering. Like someone trying to train out identity and replace it with obedience. She once asked one of the younger boys, Robert, what he wanted to be when he grew up. He blinked twice, unsure if it was a trick question, then whispered, "Whatever Madam wants." It wasn't just chilling, it was rehearsed. That's when Susan knew. This wasn't dysfunction, it was design. One Sunday, as the family filed into church, Susan lingered behind, pretending to fix her coat. She watched the children move, not like siblings, but leads, key soldiers. Same pace, same distance, same dead expressions, no interaction, no variance. Elizabeth dropped her hymnal. William picked it up without speaking. Not a smile, not a nod. It was all automated, pre-programmed. And above them, high in the church balcony, Susan noticed something she hadn't before. A teenage girl, seated alone in the shadows. Long dark hair, thin, watching the family, watching Margaret. And when Susan looked up, the girl was gone, just like the one in the window. Susan began to question everything, her training, her instincts, even her own memories of motherhood. What she was witnessing didn't fit into any manual or case file. It felt older, ritualistic. The Follings weren't just hiding children, they were molding them, erasing who they were to construct something else entirely. Each child had a carefully curated role. Elizabeth, the second oldest, was the caretaker, always near the younger ones but never affectionate. Thomas was the watcher, stationed by windows or doors, eyes scanning silently. It was a hierarchy, not a family. And at the top sat Margaret, not as mother but as sovereign. The children called her Madam, never Mom. Howard, meanwhile, remained the shadow behind the throne, rarely seen, always obeyed. Susan's own daughter Emily noticed it too. "They never talk like real kids," she once whispered. "It's like they've been trained to lie with their eyes." But the most disturbing part was how the town accepted it. The Follings gave generously to every fundraiser, every school drive, every church renovation. Their wealth and charm bought silence. Even when questions began to surface, like why the children never aged out of the home, or why their appearances seemed to shift subtly over time, no one wanted to investigate too closely. To challenge the Follings was to risk exile from the town's inner circle. But Susan couldn't let it go. She started asking quiet questions to teachers, former neighbors, even local caseworkers. Most claimed they didn't know anything. A few said they had a bad feeling. One woman who'd worked at a nearby adoption agency hung up as soon as Susan mentioned the Follings. The silence wasn't just fear. It was learned helplessness, just like what the children exhibited. And that's when Susan found the file. It was hidden inside a second-hand desk at a church rummage sale. An old manila fold, with names, photos, dates, all faintly water-damaged. 11 children, none matching the names Margaret had given, most marked as missing, all from different states. One photo showed a little girl with a birthmark under her left eye, the same girl Susan had seen in the third-floor window. Her name was Nina Ruiz. She'd been missing since 1985, and according to the state database, the case had been closed because she'd been successfully adopted. Susan knew then, these weren't just illegal adoptions. This was a cover-up, layered, old, and sanctioned by something bigger than just a family. Susan didn't sleep that night. She sat on the edge of her bed, the file open in her lap, the faces of missing children staring up like ghosts demanding justice. One name kept repeating in her mind, Nina Ruiz, the girl in the window, the one no one else claimed to see. If Nina was living under the Falling name, who else was? And how many of the so-called adopted children weren't supposed to be there at all? Susan photocopied the documents and hid the originals in a safe deposit box under Emily's name. She knew what she had stumbled into wasn't just a family secret. It was a system, a machine hiding in plain sight. And like all machines, it needed parts, obedient parts, replaceable parts. She began to track the Falling family's adoption timeline, cross-referencing it with state databases, obscure newspapers, and church directories. The pattern was brutal. Every time the Fallings adopted, a missing child report appeared within the same 3-week window. The names were different. The states were different. But the circumstances were always the same. Disadvantaged, foster care, migrant communities, children from silence, children no one would fight for. And still, no one questioned the Fallings, not even the agencies. Why? Because Howard Falling had money, connections, and a reputation built on philanthropy. He donated to every agency he worked with. Not bribes exactly, more like gratitude payments. But there was more. Each donation was followed by a new trust fund, one for each child. But the conditions were chilling. No funds could be accessed unless the child remained in regular contact with the Fallings. No searches for biological family. No speaking to press or authorities. These weren't safety nets. They were chains, financial leashes disguised as care. Susan began to understand. This wasn't just about adoption. It was about ownership, control over identity, control over a memory. And at the center of it all stood Margaret, regal and untouchable, orchestrating everything like a conductor of silent pain. Emily noticed a change in her mother, the way she flinched when the phone rang, the way she double-checked locked doors. "If something happens to me," Susan whispered one night, "don't trust anyone from that house, not even the kids." Because the deeper she looked, the more one terrifying truth became clear. Not all of the children were victims. Some had become believers, and those were the ones who would protect the system at any cost. It started with the note, slipped beneath Susan's windshield wiper at dusk, folded neatly, typed in all caps. "Stop digging, or your daughter will disappear too." No signature, no trace. Just those words, clean and cold like a surgical cut. Susan stood frozen in the church parking lot, heart hammering, eyes darting to every shadow. She clutched the note and didn't tell anyone, not even Emily. She couldn't risk it. The Follings weren't just manipulative, they were connected. And if they had been acquiring children undetected for decades, it meant someone, multiple someones, had helped them. Judges, clergy, caseworkers. Not all knowingly, perhaps, but enough to bury a truth this horrifying. And that meant Susan was alone. That week, she spotted Elizabeth again, the caretaker child, standing alone at the edge of the schoolyard. She looked older than 12 now. Taller, too still. Susan approached gently, asking if she was okay. The girl looked up, calm and expressionless.
"Madam says you're confused,"
she said.
"She says you see things that hurt you."
Then she walked away. Not angry, not frightened, just obedient. Susan could feel the walls closing. Every call she made for help was redirected. Files she once accessed online now showed as restricted. Even her supervisor at Child Services told her she might be too emotionally invested. That phrase, it rang like a sentence. It meant, back off or lose everything. But Susan wasn't backing off. She returned to the file, now committed to mapping every child's origin, every changed name, every altered adoption record. She uncovered a chilling discovery. 4 of the children had death certificates, dated years before the Follings adopted them. Yet there they were, breathing, walking, smiling like mannequins in Sunday clothes. Susan contacted one of the biological mothers listed on the records. The woman had been told her daughter drowned in 1992. Her grief had never healed. But when Susan sent her a photo taken just weeks ago outside the Falling home, the woman screamed,
"That's her. That's my baby."
But when asked to speak publicly, the mother refused.
"They told me," she whispered, "if I ever came looking, I'd join her."
That was when Susan realized the Follings weren't hiding the truth anymore. They were guarding it, proudly, systematically. Because whatever they were building inside that house, it needed believers. And some of those children weren't stolen. They had been transformed into architects of the silence. Susan's world began to erode in quiet, calculated ways. Her emails stopped sending. Her voicemail password reset itself overnight. Her spare house key vanished from under the ceramic frog in her garden, only to reappear days later, placed perfectly back where it belonged. It wasn't just intimidation now. It was intrusion. Someone wanted her to know she wasn't safe, but also that she was being allowed to continue. That's what terrified her most. Not being stopped, but being watched like a test subject, as if her reaction was part of the experiment. She started sleeping with a hammer under her pillow. Emily began having nightmares again, ones she hadn't had since she was a little girl. In them, a woman with a blank face whispered her name from the corner of her room, telling her she was almost ready. Susan kept asking, ready for what? The pressure mounted until one night Susan finally confronted Margaret at the church fundraiser. The two stood alone near the punch bowl, isolated by polite distance from the other guests.
"Why are you doing this?"
Susan whispered. Margaret just smiled, tilting her head like a mother forgiving a tantrum. "We don't do anything, dear. We become." The air between them turned glacial. Margaret leaned closer.
"Some of them come to us already broken. We offer them clarity, purpose. Isn't that what every child wants?"
Susan didn't respond. Couldn't. Margaret continued.
"You look tired, Susan. Maybe it's time to let go of this burden. For Emily's sake. The words were soft, maternal, lethal. Susan left the fundraiser shaking, nauseated by the realization that Margaret didn't see herself as cruel. She saw herself as chosen, as part of something larger, ancient, and benevolent in her own mind. And whatever that something was, Susan had stumbled into its core. That night, she found a fresh envelope on her kitchen table. No sign of forced entry. Instead, was a photograph, grainy, black and white. It showed the Falling home in 1911. 12 children standing on the porch. One of them had the same birthmark as Nina Ruiz, same face, same eyes. Susan dropped the photo in horror, because if that image was real, then this wasn't just an adoption cult. It was something far older, something cyclical, something that never died. The photo wouldn't stop vibrating in Susan's mind. Not literally, but emotionally, like a frequency she couldn't unhear. The faces were too precise, the posture of the children, the distant, reverent gaze. These weren't children caught in candid joy. They were posing for something ceremonial. She took the photo to a local historian, an old archivist named Mr. Ellery, who specialized in the town's founding families. When he saw the picture, his face lost all color. "This can't be real," he muttered. But his eyes said otherwise. He recognized the house immediately. It was the Follings home, before it was ever known by that name. "This house belonged to the Whitelawns," he whispered. "Disappeared during the influenza epidemic in 1918. Took in orphaned children. Turned their estate into a sanctum for the unwanted." But strange things happened. Reports of children vanishing. And not just from here, multiple counties. Then the fire came. Burned half the house down. They said it was lightning. But he trailed off. Susan pressed him. "What happened to the children? Were they found?" "No," he replied. "But the townspeople swore they saw them, long after the fire, wearing the same clothes, watching from the trees." Mr. Ellery agreed to research further, but he warned Susan, "This town forgets for a reason. Dig too deep, and it doesn't just bury history, it swallows it." On her way out, she passed a bulletin board covered in yellowed clippings. One article stood out. "Local orphan girl wins essay contest, 1957. The girl in the photo was unmistakable. Same birthmark, same eyes. Nina Ruiz, except the caption read, "Margaret Ann Whitelawn, age 11. Susan felt her knees weaken. If that was true, then Margaret wasn't just orchestrating this from the top, she was from the beginning. The name change, the ageless photo, the town's convenient forgetfulness, it all hinted at something unspeakers. Blay. Margaret hadn't adopted these children. She had recruited them, preserved them. Through identity, through myth, through something Susan couldn't yet name. Time wasn't linear here. The Follings weren't just a family. They were a lineage of repetition, a cycle hidden in plain sight. And Susan had just cracked it open. The air in Susan's house grew heavy after that day, like the walls had absorbed the truth and didn't want it spoken. Lights flickered, but only in the rooms where she worked on the case. Her laptop froze when she opened scanned images of the children. Even her cat refused to enter her study. But she wasn't imagining things. She knew what she'd seen. Margaret Whitelawn wasn't just a manipulator of people. She was a manipulator of time, of identity, of the very idea of who someone could be. And if Margaret had appeared as a child in 1911, then who or what was she now? Susan tried reaching the biological mother again, the one who recognized her daughter in the modern photo. No answer. She called the police. They said no one by that name lived at that address. Susan drove there herself. The mailbox was gone, the windows black, the entire lot fenced off like it had been condemned years ago.
There was no record the house had ever been occupied. And then she realized the truth. The woman had been erased. Not killed. Not disappeared. Just scrubbed from reality, like chalk on a rainy sidewalk. Susan returned home and found her front door unlocked. Inside, nothing was stolen. But her notes were gone. The files, the photos, even her calendar had been replaced, with one from 1992, the year Nina Ruiz was declared dead. On the kitchen counter, someone had left a single cassette tape. No label, no case, just the tape, like a dare. Susan didn't have a cassette player, so she went to her neighbor's garage, a retired DJ with old stereo equipment. Together they listened, static, then faint music, a children's choir singing a lullaby. The lyrics weren't in any language she recognized. Beneath the melody, a whispering voice bled through, layered so low it was almost inaudible. But one phrase emerged clearly, again and again. You cannot free what wants to stay. Her neighbor ejected the tea, ape, visibly shaken. That wasn't music, he muttered. That was a ritual. Susan took the tape and drove to the edge of the town limits. She stood beneath the same billboard that read, "Welcome to Follingsburg, a family place since 1871, and it hit her. That was the year the White Lawn Line began. Follingsburg wasn't just named after the Follings, it was built around them. Susan began constructing a wall, both literally and mentally. In her basement, she pinned up the oldest town records, school photos, census fragments, and faded newspaper clippings. She arranged them chronologically, then thematically. Disappearances, reappearances, name changes, families that only ever adopted 12 children. Patterns emerged like bruises under a blacklight. Follingsburg had no official orphanage. It never had. Yet adoption records were filed almost every year, always involving a mysterious private transfer agency known only as the Sanctum. No contact number, no physical address, just a P.O. box that, when traced, turned out to be a rusted mailbox sealed shut in the middle of a long-abandoned field. Susan went there. The grass was dead around it. She dug beneath the box. Buried 6 inches deep was a small charred wooden idol, a mother figure holding 12 children close to her chest, mouths sewn shut. On the back, "We take what is lost, we keep what is found." That night, Susan didn't sleep. Her dreams were filled with rhythmic chanting and the slow creak of floorboards above her, except she lived alone. When she jolted awake, she heard it again, wood flexing under weight. Footsteps, pacing, in her attic. She climbed the stairs, heart hammering. But when she opened the door, the attic was empty, except for a row of tiny child-sized shoes, neatly lined up in the dust. All different eras, all unlabeled. She backed down the stairs, trembling, and dialed Emily's school. No answer. She called the emergency number. The school claimed Emily had been picked up early, by her legal guardian. The woman had papers, had identification, had even known the name of Emily's childhood teddy bear. Susan dropped the phone. Her blood turned to ash, because she had never told anyone that name. Not even Emily remembered it. The following morning, Susan drove to the police station to file a kidnapping report. But when she gave them her name, the clerk frowned. "Ma'am, you don't have a daughter." Susan laughed. It was a hysterical, exhausted, disbelieving sound. But the officer wasn't joking. He pulled up her records. No children listed, no school enrollment, no birth certificate for Emily or adoption papers. Susan demanded to speak with the officer in charge. When he arrived, she nearly choked. It was the same man who had investigated the missing foster files, the one who seemed sympathetic. But he looked through her like she was air. "Have we met?" he asked. She left, trembling. Outside, she tried calling Emily's friend's parents. One answered. "Susan who?" they asked. The line dropped. Her contacts began disappearing, names replaced by numbers. Photos on her phone blurred, pixelated, corrupted. Emily's face distorted, then vanished entirely. She rushed home, pulled out her printed photos, only to find empty frames. In every one, Emily had been erased. Susan screamed. She wasn't just losing her daughter, she was being rewritten. Her memories, her entire narrative, was under siege. She ran to her closet and found the shoebox where she kept Emily's baby teeth, her first drawing, her kindergarten report card. It was gone. In its place, a handwritten note. You cannot keep what was never yours to hold. That night, a scratching began at her windows. Not tapping, scratching. Long, slow, purposeful. She called 911, but when they arrived, the officers laughed. "Ma'am," one said, "you live in the middle of nowhere. No one's out here." But Susan knew better. She hadn't just uncovered the truth, she'd violated its sanctum. And now it was correcting her. Susan stopped trusting the natural world. The trees whispered now, not in the wind, but in sync, like voices reciting a script. She tried leaving town, but the roads looped. She passed the same gas station 3 times. The same crow watched her from every telephone wire. She had become a glitch in their system, a splinter, dissonant, and someone, or something, intended to sand her back into place. Her only ally left was Mr. Ellery, the archivist. He had gone silent after their last meeting, but Susan found his address and drove to his small, ivy-choked cottage. Inside, it was ransacked, papers torn, books burned. But in the fireplace, unburned, was a small envelope. It was addressed to her, in shaking handwriting. Inside was a single photograph, an aerial shot of Follingsburg from 1875. It showed a massive symbol cut into the fields surrounding the town, a kind of crop sigil, 12 spirals around a central sun, and in the middle, the White Lawn estate. Beneath it, a message. The town is the altar. The children are the offering. They never age. They only recycle. Susan stared, unblinking. That was why none of the children had birth certificates. That was why no one remembered them after. They weren't born into the world. They were drawn through it, reused, recalled. She ran her fingers along the spiral pattern in the photo. Then she froze. It wasn't ink. It was blood. Dried, soaked into the paper, as if Ellery had tried to warn her with his final breath. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was engineered. Susan could feel it pressing in, like sound had been turned off around her. Even the birds avoided her now. The town had begun to treat her like a ghost. Store clerks didn't see her. Automatic doors didn't open. Her image stopped appearing in mirrors. But she wasn't ready to surrender. That night, she broke into the Follings estate. It was easier than she expected. No alarms, no locked doors. Inside, the house was silent and preserved, like a museum exhibit. Portraits lined the walls, all depicting children. And all the same 12 faces, over and over, different clothes, different centuries, but always 12, always the same eyes. In the center of the grand room stood a pedestal. On it, a red leather-bound book. She opened it. Inside were names, dates, symbols, ritual cycles, cleansing, reaping, restoration. She flipped to the last page. A new name was being written, slowly, by an invisible hand. The ink glided across the page, letter by letter. Susan Mira Calhoun. She dropped the book. Footsteps echoed above her, then laughter, high-pitched, childlike. 12 voices. She turned, but the house had changed. The door was gone. The windows, bricked shut. She was inside the cycle now. She was the 13th. Time buckled inside the house. Susan moved through rooms that shifted behind her. Doors led to staircases that twisted back into the same hallway. The wallpaper peeled in reverse. Dust fell upward.
But the most unsettling part, the children were watching, not in person, but through the paintings. Every room had them. Portraits of the 12, heads tilted, eyes shimmering with life. In the kitchen, the same boy appeared 3 times. Once in 1800s sailor garb, once in 1950s Sunday best, and once in a modern hoodie. Same expression, same smirk. The air grew heavier, as if the house was breathing her in. Then, a sound. A child humming. A tune she didn't recognize, yet somehow knew. It came from behind a locked door at the end of the hall. She pressed her ear to the wood. Silence. Then a whisper. "Susan, we missed you." Her breath hitched. She twisted the knob. It opened. The nursery beyond was impossibly preserved. Victorian cradle, hand-carved toys, faded alphabet wallpaper. On the far wall, scratched into plaster, was a countdown. 12, 11, 10. She turned, realizing there were only 10 visible portraits now. 2 had gone blank. She fled the room, heart pounding. The children weren't just haunting the house, they were repopulating it. And whatever was guiding them had just moved her name up the list. She tried breaking a window. Her fists bounced back like she'd hit stone. The walls refused damage. Even her screams seemed absorbed by the wallpaper. Desperate, she returned to the pedestal. The red book still sat there, its pages now glowing faintly. She flipped to the front. The first name in the ledger was Miriam Follings, dated 1822. A mother, the founder, the one who opened the gate, according to the scrawled margin notes. She sacrificed her own children, then pulled them back, not as ghosts, but as presences. She didn't just adopt 12 kids, she created vessels, and she taught her bloodline how to do the same. Susan turned to the back. Her name was no longer alone. Beneath it, a second line was appearing. Emily Calhoun. The ink bled onto the page like veins. That was the final blow. She understood now. They weren't taking Emily to erase her. They were taking her to transform her into the next vessel, not to destroy her memories, but to overwrite them. Emily would become part of the cycle, one of the 12, reborn, forgotten, used again. Susan dropped the book and screamed, but the sound didn't echo. The house absorbed it, content. She wasn't just in the ritual, she was becoming part of its memory. The walls began to whisper, not in English, not in any known tongue, but in low guttural tones that sounded wet, like lungs breathing words. The portraits wept black tears, the house exhaled dust, and in the parlor, 12 child-sized chairs arranged themselves in a perfect circle. Susan, almost entranced, walked toward them. On each seat, a token, a doll, a tooth, a lock of hair. In the final chair, Emily's old sock. She dropped to her knees. "Please," she begged, "take me. Let her go." The fire in the hearth roared suddenly, forming a shape. Miriam Follings, her eyes glowing like coals, mouth sewn shut with red thread. She raised one hand and pointed to the window. Outside in the moonlit garden stood the 12 children, all barefoot, all smiling, and in the center, Emily, wearing a Victorian dress, holding a candle. She looked up at Susan with eyes that no longer knew her, eyes that belonged to something else. Then they turned and walked single file into the hedge maze beyond the garden. Susan ran to the window and screamed her daughter's name. But Emily never turned back, and Susan finally understood. The Follings didn't adopt orphans to love them. They adopted vessels to store memory. The town never forgot. It just recycled what it needed to keep the machine running. Susan didn't remember leaving the house. One moment she was screaming at the window. The next she stood in the middle of the hedge maze, her clothes torn, her nails caked in earth. Branches around her pulsed, as if breathing. The maze whispered her name in a dozen different childlike voices. "Susan, Susan." It wasn't a maze built to confuse. It was built to contain. She followed the flicker of Emily's candlelight, glimpsed just beyond the next bend. But when she reached it, the candle had moved again. Always close. Never touchable. Then came the laughter. Hollow. Timeless. She stumbled into a clearing, and the center of the maze opened like a stage. A sunken pit, surrounded by stone steps carved with names, some ancient, some recent. In the pit stood 12 mannequins dressed in the exact clothes she'd seen on the children in the paintings. Their faces were blank, until she blinked. Then the eyes were there, wet, real, watching her. A 13th spot was empty. Her knees gave out. The ground beneath her pulsed with warmth, like a living thing. Her body felt heavier. Her name throbbed behind her eyes. Then, above her, the whispers unified into a chant. She is ready. One mannequin turned its head. Susan couldn't run anymore. Her body no longer obeyed the command. The maze, the pit, the air itself, all conspired to hold her in place. Her mind spun with fractured images. Emily's face smiling. Emily's voice echoing in reverse. Emily laughing, but not her laugh. The children emerged from the hedges one by one. Real now. Physical. They walked with the heavy grace of marionettes. Their mouths didn't move, but the air buzzed with their thoughts. "You're the final one, Susan. You always were." She tried to speak, but her throat sealed tight, as if her body remembered a ritual older than her will. Then, from behind the crowd, stepped Miriam Follings. Flesh. Real. Not flame. Dressed in a black lace morning gown, her presence warped the space around her. "You broke the circle," she said, her voice like dried leaves. "Now it must be remade." She pointed to the 13th pedestal. Susan's feet began to move on their own. "No," Susan whispered, tears streaming. "Please, let me see her again. Just let me." "You will," Miriam replied, "but not as you." And with that, the children surrounded Susan. Their hands were gentle, their eyes were filled with memory. As they touched her, her skin began to glow, then fracture. Her name faded. In the end, there was no scream, just silence. And then, Susan was gone. Where she once stood now lay a small red thread-bound doll, identical to the others placed in the chairs back in the parlor. The children bowed their heads. Miriam took the doll and placed it in the 13th chair. The circle was complete again. Above the house, a pulse of light shivered through the clouds, visible only to those who'd ever lost a child they couldn't explain. And somewhere, in a hospital several states away, a newborn girl cried out. A nurse glanced at the file. Adopted via private agency, no prior records. Mother, M. Follings. Back in Follingsburg, the townspeople stirred uneasily. No one mentioned the name Follings anymore, not since the fire, but everyone felt when the cycle reset. Some swore they saw a child walking alone by the lake. Others claimed to hear music under the floorboards. But the oldest among them simply nodded and turned away. Because in Follingsburg, every generation owed a memory to the house, and the house always came to collect. The town of Follingsburg didn't mourn Susan Calhoun. Her disappearance was explained away. "Ran off with someone," they whispered, "or too much pressure after the divorce." The sheriff wrote a quiet report, then burned it. The pastor offered no sermon, but in the local library, the librarian, Mrs. Emery, now nearly blind, pulled out a forgotten town register and added a note beside Susan's name. Collected. Meanwhile, Emily Calhoun sat quietly at a nearby orphanage. But she wasn't called Emily anymore. The staff referred to her as Nora, a name found scribbled on the application forms that nobody recalled submitting. She never cried, never asked for her mother. She only stared at the stained glass windows and hummed a lullaby none of the workers recognized, low, melodic, and wrong. One night, the other children found her in the attic, arranging old toys in a circle. When asked what she was doing, she simply said, "Waiting for my family to remember me." And then she smiled, but it wasn't her smile. It was older, knowing. And from that day forward, one child each year would vanish from the orphanage without record. No one asked too many questions. Not in Follingsburg. Not anymore. Years passed. The Follings house sat dormant, or so it appeared. Ivy choked the walls. The roof sagged, windows clouded with grime. But locals claimed they still saw candles flicker behind the upstairs curtain. Ghost stories swirled. Teenagers dared each other to touch the front gate. Some never came back the same. But the truth? The house was never empty. Beneath its floors, beyond the nursery, through hidden tunnels carved by generations of occult hands, the circle remained alive. The dolls were tended, the names recorded, the ritual kept. A man named Harold Beck, a local historian, began researching the Follings lineage. What he found disturbed him. Every few decades, 12 adopted children, always without records, always erased. He followed the trail backward. The names changed, but the pattern never did. Finally, he returned to the house, driven by obsession. He brought documents, photographs, a recorder. But inside, time unraveled. His equipment failed. His voice on tape vanished. The last photo on his camera showed not the house, but 12 children standing behind him, though no one else had been with him that day. Beck was found days later, walking the highway barefoot, eyes wide, whispering, "They're not adopted. They're archived." Beck's testimony was discarded as delusion. Institutionalized, he spent his final months drawing circles over and over again. 13 seats, always 13, never 12. But one nurse listened. Marla Jennings. Young, skeptical, but curious. She took one of Beck's drawings home. That night, her toddler son woke screaming, pointing at the closet. "The girl in the window wants to come in," he sobbed. Marla checked. Nothing. But each night, the screaming returned. She researched Beck's case, found the Follings name, found the orphanage, found the house. Her curiosity deepened. She drove to Follingsburg, took photos, sat in her car across from the house, staring into its empty windows. Then one blinked. She swore it. Just a blink. Not the light. The window itself. It rippled like skin. The next morning, her son no longer recognized her, called her the other mommy, refused to touch her. And on his drawings, stick figures stood in circles, one always crossed out. Marla didn't return to Follingsburg. But sometimes, in her home, she swore she heard a second heartbeat in the walls. Fainter, younger, learning to beat in sync with hers. Because the house didn't need her to move in. It just needed her to remember it. Some places carry memory like disease, spread not by air or blood, but by curiosity. The Follings house, long abandoned, became an object of obsession for a group of paranormal investigators. They called themselves the Forgotten Frame, a small YouTube crew hungry for virality. They broke in one autumn night, streaming live to 14,000 viewers. The video opened with grainy footage, creaking floors, thermal scans, EMF spikes. Then the feed started looping. Same hallway, same door. No matter where they turned, they always ended up outside the nursery. The wallpaper peeled itself back. On it, faint outlines of children's names emerged, some half erased. A door creaked open on its own. Inside, a wooden high chair facing the corner. It rocked slowly, though no one touched it. The host, Dylan, joked nervously, "Guess the ghost baby wants snack time." Seconds later, the rocking stopped. In the static, a child's voice whispered, "You're late." Screams. The camera fell. Stream ended. Viewers thought it was a stunt, until the crew never posted again. All three vanished. But months later, someone found their channel reactivated. A new video uploaded, no title, just a still frame. 12 children sitting in a circle, smiling.
And at the center, a 13th camera. The house stopped pretending after that. It no longer needed secrecy. It wanted witnesses. Mail arrived to random homes across the state, postmarked from Follingsburg Parish. Inside, blank birth certificates, each with space for one name. Families who opened them reported strange symptoms, fevers that reversed aging, mirrors that delayed reflections, and dreams of hollow cribs filled with bones. One couple, the Drenners, burned the certificate immediately, but the next day their teenage son called them by different names. "Mom? Dad? Why don't you remember me from before?" The mother wept. "Before what?" He just smiled. The following week, he vanished from every family photo, replaced by a smudged silhouette. Meanwhile, the father's handwriting began to change, letters curving in unfamiliar flourishes. The police called it identity psychosis. The town called it the invitation. But survivors called it recognition. Because to the house, names were never random. They were pulled, harvested, assigned. And every blank certificate was a seed, waiting for someone to sign it, to remember, to invite the child back. The Follings weren't a family. They were a mechanism, a ritual disguised as kinship, a machine disguised as love. Their children weren't adopted. They were repurposed, gathered, sorted, and folded into the house's memory. Across the years, the pattern held, 12 without records, always followed by a fire, always followed by a silence that lasted decades. But the 13th? The 13th was never the same. The 13th was the anchor, the one meant to wander, to forget, to live among the rest of us, until they heard the call again, until they returned. Susan was a 13th. So was Beck. So was Marla's son. Anchors were never meant to survive. They were meant to be the house's outposts, fractured pieces of its will. And now, another anchor had awakened. A boy in Oregon began drawing the Follings crest without knowing its meaning. A woman in Kentucky wrote letters to children she'd never had, signing them M. Follings. Across the world, the family was remembering itself. Because the cycle wasn't local, it never had been. The house was simply the mouth. But the hunger, that lived everywhere. The U.S. Department of Records once tried to audit Follingsburg, not for ghosts, but for funding irregularities. A bureaucratic team arrived in the spring of 1994 to investigate the town's missing census data. Entire generations were undocumented. Properties had owners who'd been dead for 80 years. Tax records vanished. Births occurred without hospitals. On the third day, the lead agent, Paula Henley, filed an urgent report. Follingsburg contains at least 37 anomalies in demographic continuity, possible coordinated fraud dating back to 1896. That was her last official transmission. Her partner found her in the Follings house basement days later, mumbling in a dead dialect of Old Saxon. Her hands bled from copying strange symbols into the stone walls, circles, with 13 marks each. When hospitalized, she only repeated one phrase. "I remember the cradle now. I was in it. I was in all of them." The government sealed the town records, shut down the audit. No further reports were filed. And for years after, agents who touched the Follings file experienced nosebleeds, sleeplessness, and, most disturbingly, missing time. 2 hours here, a day there. No one ever picked up the case again. It had been archived. There are whispers that the Follings were never just one family, but a lineage of function. Names didn't matter. Faces changed. What mattered was the role, the listener, the feeder, the binder, the keeper of ash. Each child had a designation, though they never spoke of it aloud. It was impressed upon them, through lullabies, rituals, repetition. The 13th always bore the burden of remembering all roles at once. In 1872, a train derailed outside Follingsburg. Dozens killed, no survivors identified, but one of the wrecked cars contained only 12 empty cradles.
No luggage, no adult seats, no bodies. Just fine linens and hand-stitched initials. A. Follings, B. Follings, up to L. Investigators assumed it was a delivery gone wrong. They ignored the blood beneath the cradles. They ignored the 13th cradle, charred black and fused to the floor. Newspapers briefly reported the anomaly, then retracted. The journalist who wrote the story jumped from a bell tower days later. In his pocket, a drawing of the Follings house and a note reading, "They're not dead, they're between." Between what? Nobody ever asked. Maybe because deep down, they feared the answer. The town eventually erased itself. Follingsburg disappeared from maps by 2003. GPS glitches rerouted drivers around it. Mail stopped delivering. Phone signals failed a mile out. Satellite photos blurred the area with digital artifacts, as if the town pixelated itself out of existence. And yet, people still came. Not tourists, not researchers, just those who felt called. One was Jonah Marr, a former child psychologist haunted by dreams of children singing in reverse. He painted what he saw: a house with a heartbeat, windows like closed eyes, and children whose mouths were sewn into smiles. He painted obsessively until one day he stopped, walked barefoot for 18 miles to where Follingsburg once was. He found it. No one else could. The town was there, but not there. It stood in a way that bent your eyes. Sound vanished inside it. He left his phone on the outskirts, still recording. The footage captured one word, spoken by 12 voices in unison. "Welcome." And then, a laugh. Low, parental, inhuman. The phone was later found in a thrift store in Arizona. Battery full, memory wiped. But faintly, under the plastic, someone had scratched, "We are still 12. A former priest turned occult researcher, Father Lorne Merrick, once claimed the Follings weren't merely people, but ritual positions in a forgotten faith. He called it the doctrine of echoes, a belief that memory itself is a kind of God, and children are the vessels through which it reassembles. Merrick believed the Follings house was never built to shelter. It was constructed to concentrate memory. In one of his hidden journals, Merrick wrote, "The 13th child must suffer to balance the ledger. Pain is the ink. Trauma is the signature." He believed every adoption was a rebirth rite, designed not to save orphans, but to create them, to fabricate origin points where none existed. Because no past means no anchor. You can bend such a child into anything. Merrick vanished in 2006, right after publishing a fragmented essay titled "Birthmarks in Bone." Years later, his bones were found inside a church bell in Rhode Island, as if folded to fit. His skull was carved with 13 names. No one could explain how the bell had rung every Sunday since. By 2011, survivors began to speak, but not with words. Through artifacts. A quilt surfaced at an estate sale in Ohio, handmade and stitched with 12 portraits. Each face was slightly wrong, too symmetrical, eyes too large, all smiling in identical curves. A buyer reported sleepless nights and waking visions of orphanages that didn't exist. Another piece emerged, a child's music box that played 13 notes instead of 12. Those who heard the final chime swore it wasn't a note. It was a breath. One man smashed the box after his newborn began humming its melody in her crib. Still, more objects appeared. A tin lunchbox that grew warm when unopened, a photograph that bled when copied, a child's shoe containing teeth. Always there were 12 matching items. And then, the 13th, the unexplainable, the invitation. These were not relics. They were nodes, beacons calling the forgotten back to each other, whispering across time, "Come home, the nursery is ready." And those who listened too long began to forget who they had been. The final known case tied to the Follings occurred in 2019. A child named Ellis
disappeared from a foster home in Montana. No record of adoption, no birth certificate, just one blurry photo of him in the snow, facing away from the camera. Authorities found his room empty, except for a single wall painted black, covered in chalk numbers. 12 rows, one missing. Days later, his foster sister found him standing in the forest, staring at the sky, barefoot in the snow, untouched by cold. He looked over his shoulder and said, "I can't come back. I've been claimed." His eyes were silver, not a reflection, not a trick. Solid silver, like mercury, like mirrors. He vanished when she blinked. The wall in his room was later discovered to contain layered handwriting beneath the chalk, names written over and over in ancient ink, bleeding up through paint. 13 names, always 13, different each time. But at the center, one remained consistent across all versions. M. Follings. No one has ever found her, but her children keep appearing, remembering, calling others back, because memory is a mother too, and she's still waiting. There's a house somewhere that doesn't appear on any map. Its architecture shifts, sometimes colonial, sometimes Gothic, sometimes just wrong. The door is always red, always slightly ajar. It appears only to those who've forgotten something vital, people with blank pages in their history. Those people report the same sensation, a lullaby they almost remember, one they never learned. Inside, the walls are warm, the clocks tick backward, and there are photographs of children, but their faces are mirrors. Visitors hear voices from the second floor, not calling for help, but inviting them to stay. Some try to leave. They always return. One man ran for 3 days, only to arrive back at the red door. His shoes melted to the porch. He cried until the door opened again, and then he smiled. Inside, he was assigned a name, a role, a bunk, and a sibling. He said it felt like coming home, even though he had no memory of ever being there. It wasn't hypnosis. It wasn't insanity. It was inheritance. Because the Follings weren't a family. They were a place, a condition, a contagion passed through stories, photographs, artifacts. And now, it's remembering you. If you're still listening, it's too late. The story has already taken hold. That's how they spread. Not through blood or inheritance, but through attention, curiosity, sympathy. You cared about the children. You wanted to know what happened. And now the house knows you. It remembers. Somewhere nearby, you might begin to hear tapping, like little feet above the ceiling. You might dream of staircases that lead downward forever. You'll start to forget small things. The name of your second-grade teacher, the smell of your father's cologne, the color of the sky before storms. Not all at once. Just enough to make room. They don't come all at once, you see. They come one at a time. A knock, a whisper, a shadow too still. Until one day you'll find a photograph in your drawer, a picture of 12 children, and you, in the center, smiling, because you were always part of them, and you always will be. The house doesn't need walls to exist. It only needs memory. And now, it has yours.